The following statements in this video are based on opinion. If you feel we are wrong or left anything out, please leave us your opinion in the comments. Obviously, it is up to the viewer what old tech still holds up by their standards. Thank you for your time and hope you enjoy. Hello everyone and welcome back to Old Tech Talk, the series we discuss how well older technology holds up by today's standards. Here with us as always is co-founder Daniel.
Hi Internet.
In this episode of Old Tech Talk, we discuss history's longest, most well-known portable gaming device, the Nintendo Game Boy. Released in Japan on April 21st, 1989, and then in the US in July 31st, 1989. So before we begin this episode, there's a couple things I would like to address. First, before we began this episode, Daniel and myself were discussing what our next Old Tech episode should be, and he suggested the Game Boy Advance SP, which is the slimmer laptop-like model. Thing is, though, I told Daniel that if we're going to do what we consider to be the best of all the Game Boys, we need to talk about all the Game Boys, because some are more expensive than others. We approached our friend Corey Strite, who co-founds Classics and Oddities with his wife, Shanae Strite, and we asked him if he was okay with us recording in his shop. Unfortunately, things didn't work out and we were unable to record in the shop today. However, though, he has been showing us continuing support and he did loan us pretty much each and every model of the Game Boy that's ever been made, with the exception of one, and we will get to that and still discuss our thoughts about that particular model. If you live in the Longview area, please stop by Classics and Oddities. They have so many things other than classic retro games. Some of the things that you will find in store is a lot more affordable than other places you go to. Not only that, you would find very interesting things, because not only is it a place to collect classic things, it's also a place to collect odd little things such as Beetlejuice collectibles or Doctor Who stuff. You have no idea what's going to be in the shop. Just go in, check it out for yourself. You will find something different every time you enter the store. We highly recommend Classics and Oddities here at Old Tech Talk. To the owners of Classics and Oddity, thank you for your continuing support. We very much appreciate it. So going from here, the Game Boy was actually designed by Nintendo's Research and Development 1 team, headed by legendary engineer Gunpei Yokoi, the genius behind the company's Game Watch series of handheld LCD games. Yokoi came up with a pivotal design philosophy, lateral thinking with weathered technology, which meant using cheap, readily available components in interesting ways. Basically, they used cheaper parts even though better parts did exist at the time.
And the reason why they chose to do this, it was sacrificing between battery life or efficiency. So, and that's a huge thing to have to sacrifice. The Game Gear didn't do that. Game Gears took tons of batteries, it was color from day one, but it was way more expensive, and Nintendo knew that if they made their product too expensive, no one would be able to buy it. So instead of choosing to do a backlighting and to make it full color right off the bat, they chose to make it as battery efficient as possible by making it a black and white screen that you could control the contrast to make it darker or brighter depending on how you viewed the screen yourself. For that reason, it might not be the first, but it's certainly one of the most memorable handheld consoles, as well as one of the most that have stood the test of time. Everyone has either seen, heard of, or played a Game Boy in any one of its many renditions.
Lasted so long, in fact, that it just kept going until 2005, where the Game Boys finally ended with the DS line. For whatever reason, they just decided to drop the Game Boy name. Like, they just thought at some point, hey, we need a better name that would reach out towards our adult gaming audience, because we don't want a Game Boy, which is a name that sounds just for kids. We need something that needs to be a lot more adult. So even though Game Boy is well renowned and known, they still were like, we need to try something new, and they did, and the DS sold incredibly well, and for very good reason. It's a very solid console. You could play Game Boy Advance on a DS, but you can't play original Game Boy cartridges on the DS.
The original one did play Game Boy Advance games, like Michael mentioned, but it was not farther backwards compatible, which I understand that, they were trying to phase out the Game Boy franchise, and I get that. You can't have one make and model of something last forever, obviously. But it is sad that they killed the Game Boy name, and we will now have a moment of silence for the Game Boy.
R.I.P. Game Boy.
R.I.P.
Well, however, people still reminisce and get nostalgic enough for the Game Boy that new third-party companies are still cloning the Game Boy. New Game Boys are actually on its way right now, which is fantastic news for those of us that grew up with the console. But our show is all about how well older technology holds up today. So we're going to go ahead and get started on this, guys, because we're going to the very first model and working our way up. So here we have it, the Brick. This is the original Game Boy that was made in 1989. This thing was modeled a couple years after the original Nintendo's release, but right before the release of the Super Nintendo by just, again, a few years. So this was an in-between console between the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. So at this point, people really wanted quality games on the go. It's not that portable games didn't exist at the time, it was just the fact that back then, all the older games were either really crappy watch-like battery games like the Tiger Toys. It was either that or the more expensive stuff, which is, I believe, the Atari Lynx or something similar to that with, you know, bright LCD screens. I was only 2 when the Game Boy was originally released, so I can't say what all devices exist from personal experience. I can only tell you that I have had the pleasure of growing up with this thing. You see, once upon a time, they were trying to come up with a concept about making a cheaper portable device that everyone will enjoy at a good price, but still quality. So they tried to think, and they came up with something, and they're like, hey guys, what if we use those calculator-like graphics, but actually make games a lot more console-like than these cheapo companies? And that's an idea for a portable console was born. So making this thick thing that boasts battery life using a really cheap screen at the time, but has a lot more power and capabilities than the cheaper competitors sounded like a good plan to sell a product.
While the Game Boy did honestly last a long time, it came with a price. The Game Boy required 4 AA batteries, and back in the late 80s, early 90s, battery technology wasn't the best, obviously. So, you know, even if you went out and bought brand new name brand Duracell or Energizer batteries, you were still forking over probably 4 batteries a day or, you know, every other day, depending on how long and how much you played your Game Boy.
Within 2 weeks after the Game Boy's original launch, though, it was already a huge success, especially because it came bundled with an already well-known and popular game, which was only playable on the original Nintendo at the time, Tetris. This is one of my favorite classic games, but that was before I got to play Pokemon and stuff even. Do you like Tetris at all? Do you play it at all?
Oh, I don't play it anymore. I'm sure I played it as a kid, but I don't care for games that kill time, and that's all Tetris is. It's a time-killing game.
I guess so. It's a puzzle game, and I kind of like puzzle games. But, you know, to each their own. So how well does this old Game Boy hold up? Well, to be honest with you, it doesn't. This thing was made in the late 80s. Again, during a time where backlights and colored displays were very expensive. This is before color, before backlights, before anything that we take for granted today with cell phones and current generation mobile technology. This is all that with all that stuff that we have today. Back then in the late 80s, this is what we had. We had this screen that was blurry as hell, and you had to use this contrast adjuster just to see what you're doing on a game. Otherwise, you'd be sitting in the dark, confused as hell, trying to play a game you wouldn't be able to see normally. The good news is that there is a third-party add-on where you can click over it, enhance the buttons, enhance the screen with a magnifying glass, enhance the lighting underneath the magnifying glass, and even adds big honking speakers on the side. Now, back then, that was cool because you could actually see what you're playing in the freaking dark. But if you tried to carry something like that around today on this, which sadly we don't have with us, but if you tried to walk around with something like that, with this and all that today, people would just be looking at you like, what the hell is wrong with that guy? If there's any reason to have a Game Boy as of the making of this video, if there's any reason to have an original Game Boy, it's to put on your shelf. This is the world's first portable Nintendo gaming console, and it was a huge staple in the gaming community. And that's the one reason why you'd want to have it, but not very likely you're going to want to play it all the time.
And thanks to Corey, we were even able to find a rarity. This is the Black Game Boy original. A lot of people didn't know this even existed. I myself have never seen this before until we got this from him. And we have the classic Pokemon Yellow in here, for all you fans out there, because we wanted to see what it was like to play Pokemon Yellow under this original screen again. And let me tell you, it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. I am so glad I don't remember playing it on one of these old guys, because it was absolutely terrible.
So, final thoughts on the original Game Boy, Daniel.
You know, for its time, it was like we mentioned earlier. Nintendo wanted to make the cheapest thing that they could, but the best functioning they could. They succeeded. It has low-end graphics, but for its time, it wasn't terrible graphics. It was better than the predecessors, but it wasn't as good as some other companies like Sega. The Game Gear, better screen, but once again, way more expensive. I think it took 6 or 8 triple or AA batteries, way even bulkier. But for its time, it definitely was a great console, but it has not stood the test of time at all.
So, overall rating between 1 to 10, Daniel?
You know, because it was the first, I'm gonna give it maybe a 2. It's definitely.
Oh, that's a real low rating on your part.
It's definitely a stepping stone. It was step 1 of a several tier stepping ladder or stepping ring.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty low rating, but I understand where you're coming from. Because it's the first Game Boy, though, we're doing this rating based on how well it holds up today, not how overall it succeeded as a console or for its merits of quality and build at the time. But it is a classic, it was a staple in history, and to me, I'm going to give it, a 4.5. Overall, between Daniel and mine's rating, somewhere between 2 and 4.5. I guess that
3-ish?
3.5?
3.5-ish, maybe?
Let's give it a 4. Let's be fair, don't you think? Let's give it a 4.
Sure, let's give it an even solid 4.
Even solid 4, guys. But it's still fun to pick up and play now and then, but it does not hold a candle to anything that's going on currently graphic-wise. Thank you for watching the first of a several-part episode of the Game Boy Console series. If you like this episode, please leave a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe. Tune in next time for the Game Boy Pocket review. See you then.